There is a move that American defense procurement makes so often, it has stopped looking like a choice and started looking like a reflex. Faced with a costly high-end capability and a cheaper near-term alternative, the institution reaches for the cheaper one and tells itself the reach was a luxury. It is almost never argued as a loss. It is argued as prudence, as efficiency, as a responsible thing to do with the taxpayers' money. And then, some years later, the threat environment shifts. The cheaper alternative turns out to be the wrong tool, and the capability that was traded away is suddenly the thing the country needs and no longer has. Call it the flinch. It is not one decision, it is a pattern, repeated across decades and administrations by both parties, in airframes and industries and whole force structures. The United States has repeatedly traded long-range, high-end, hard-to-replace capability for near-term efficiency and has repeatedly been caught short when the threat environment demanded the reach it gave away. The capability was rarely the problem. The willingness to keep it, to pay for the full-on version instead of the affordable compromise, was the thing that kept failing. This is not a jingoist's complaint and is not nostalgia. It will criticize American decisions freely because the point is precisely that the decisions were ours. It will also, at the end, lay out the honest case against itself. The real reasons the flinch sometimes made sense, because a thesis built only from the cases that flatter it is not a thesis, it is a grievance. The spine holds, and the spine is this: we keep trading away reach, and the bill keeps coming due. The cleanest early illustration is the tenure of Dick Cheney as Secretary of Defense from 1989 to 1993. At the exact moment the Cold War ended and the appetite for a peace dividend became overwhelming. Cheney testified that over his time as Secretary he had taken the 5-year defense plan down by well over $300 billion, and he chafed publicly that Congress kept forcing him to buy systems. He named the F-14 among them, that he did not believe filled a vital need. He dismissed the F-14 as old technology, a 1960s design, and characterized continued production as something closer to a jobs program than a military requirement. So he stopped it. F-14D production was capped at a few dozen airframes rather than carried forward, and the proposed evolutionary path, a low-risk, high-capability development of the F-14D, sometimes called the Super Tomcat 21, which would have kept the long-range two-seat big radar fleet defense interceptor alive and modernized, was refused in favor of what became the F-A-18E and F Super Hornet, a short-legged, multi-role aircraft that was cheaper and more flexible, but gave up the reach the Tomcat owned. The Navy traded its long arm for a more affordable jack of all trades. Then on January 7, 1991, Cheney canceled the A-12 Avenger II, the Navy's highest priority aircraft program, a carrier-based stealth attack aircraft meant to replace the all-weather deep strike A-6 Intruder. It was, at the time, the largest contract termination in Pentagon history. With it died the Navy's plans for a stealthy, long-range, all-weather carrier strike platform, and the A-6 soldiered on toward retirement with no true successor in its class. The medium attack mission was eventually folded into the same multi-role Hornet that could not match the A-6's range or payload. Now here's the honest counterweight, and it matters. The A-12 was not canceled out of pure short-sightedness. It was a genuinely troubled program, a fixed-price development contract running massively over cost and behind schedule, part of a cluster of contract programs whose combined overruns were measured in the billions. Cheney had real cause, and the broader drawdown was not madness. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and some reduction was both inevitable and correct. The criticism is not that nothing should have been cut. It is that the cuts fell on reach, on the long-range, high-end capabilities that are slowest and hardest to rebuild, and that the replacements chosen were consistently the cheaper, shorter, more compromised tools. You can grant every budgetary fact and still observe that the shape of the cuts traded the arm for the fist. The vindication came later and quietly. By the 2020s, with the Pacific looming, the Navy was designing its next generation fighter, the FAXX, explicitly around long range and the very fleet defense and deep reach qualities the Tomcat had and the Super Hornet lacked. 30 years after the long range interceptor was killed as obsolete 1960s tech, the service set out to rebuild what it had thrown away. The reach was never obsolete. It was inconvenient, and then it was gone, and then it was needed. If the Cheney cuts had traded away specific capabilities, what happened next traded away the capacity to build them at all. In the fall of 1993, Secretary of Defense Les Aspin and his deputy, the future Secretary William Perry, hosted a private dinner at the Pentagon for the chief executives of America's largest defense contractors. The guests, some 24 of them, did not know why they had been summoned. Norman Augustine, then head of Martin Marietta, later recalled asking Aspin why they were there and being told he would find out in 15 minutes and that he would probably not like it. The message, once delivered, was blunt. Defense spending, already on a 5-year slide, was going to fall much farther and much faster, and the Pentagon could no longer sustain an industry of its current size. An in-house study had concluded the nation needed only 2 fighter aircraft makers where it then had 5, and 1 bomber builder where it had 3. Similar verdicts were reached for tanks, submarines, missiles, and satellites. The government would not choose the survivors. It would, in Perry's reported phrasing, expect defense companies to go out of business and stand by and watch it happen. The contractors should merge and merge fast. Augustine, seeing the implication immediately, turned to the men beside him and remarked that one of them would not be there next year. He coined the evening's name on the spot, the Last Supper. He was right. Within a year, his own Martin Marietta merged with Lockheed to form Lockheed Martin. Over the following years, the roughly 51 prime contractors of the late Cold War collapsed into 5 giants: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. The deep, redundant, competitive industrial base that had produced the most complete air arsenal in history was, by design and by invitation, distilled down to a handful of mega primes. The negative benefits, to borrow the bitter phrase, took decades to fully surface, but they are now plain. Competition collapsed. In role after role, there is now 1 bidder, or 2, where there were once 5. The discipline that competition imposes on price and performance simply evaporated in those lanes. Surge capacity vanished. The excess capacity the consolidation was meant to wring out was, in part, the very slack that lets a nation ramp production in a crisis, the half-utilized factories and redundant lines that look like waste in peacetime and look like survival in war. Single points of failure multiplied. When one firm builds a whole category, that firm's problem, a strike, a defect, a cost spiral, a clothesline, becomes the nation's problem, with no second source to fall back on. And the promised savings were oversold. Consolidation did reduce overhead, but it also produced monopoly and oligopoly pricing. The loss of competitive cost discipline and an industrial base too thin to surge, costs that do not appear on the tiny ledger that justified the dinner. The most damning verdict on the Last Supper belongs to the men who hosted it. 2 decades later, William Perry, the architect, publicly judged the result an unnecessary, undesirable consolidation of the defense industry, and said plainly that it had turned out badly, warning the Pentagon against allowing any more of it. When the man who summoned the dinner spends his later years cautioning the country against what the dinner produced, the case is close to closed. In fairness, and the fairness is real, some scholars argue the Last Supper's causal role is overstated. Consolidation had already been underway since the mid 1980s. The post Cold War budget collapse genuinely demanded contraction, and a defense base sized for a superpower confrontation could not have been preserved intact on a peacetime budget. All true. But some contraction was inevitable does not excuse. We contracted to 5 primes with no surge capacity and called it efficiency. The drawdown was necessary, the degree, and the loss of all redundancy were a choice. The same Flinch, now applied not to a weapon, but to the ability to make weapons at all. The Cold War force was not merely large, it was complete. For nearly any mission a planner could name, there existed a purpose-built tool, and most of these tools were the best in the world at the one thing they did. Air superiority had the F-15, built so single-mindedly its designers swore off a pound of weight for air to ground. Fleet defense had the F-14, reaching out 100 miles with the Phoenix. Deep all-weather strike had the A-6. Close support had the A-10. Strategic reconnaissance had the SR-71 at the edge of space. Tactical recon had the RF-4. Electronic warfare had dedicated prowlers and ravens. Defense suppression had dedicated wild weasels. Carrier anti-submarine work had the S-3. Pull up a roll, and the airframe built for it was already in the inventory, ready and excellent. The depth was not a luxury. It was resilience. A deep, diverse bench degrades gracefully and adapts to surprise. If a threat emerges that counters one platform, 11 others remain, and the force leans on what still works while it adapts. A diverse ecosystem survives a blight that kills a monoculture. And crucially, the deep bench was affordable precisely because each specialist was simpler than a do-everything platform. A focus tool carries only the complexity its one job requires, and complexity is what you pay for, in acquisition and in sustainment, for the life of the fleet. The Flinch hollowed all of this out. The drive toward the multi-role, the joint, the universal platform, the Super Hornet absorbing the roles of the Tomcat, the Intruder, and others. The F-35 conceived as the single airframe for 3 services and most allies, was sold as efficiency through commonality. But every multi-role compromise is paid for in every role. The universal airframe is heavier than a pure fighter, slower than a pure interceptor, less survivable low than a pure attack plane, and more expensive to sustain than any of them, because it carries the complexity of all the jobs at once, even when it is only doing one. The promise was one cheap common fleet. The result was one exquisite, complex fleet whose lifetime sustainment costs run into the trillions. Less effective in each role, less resilient as a whole, and, on honest accounting, not even reliably cheaper than the deep bench it replaced. And the specific capability that was traded away most consistently was the one hardest to rebuild: range. The Tomcat's reach, the Intruder's reach, the long legs of a force built to fight across oceans. These were given up for shorter-range multi-role aircraft optimized for the permissive close-in wars the country happened to be fighting in the 1990s and 2000s. Reach is the slowest capability to regenerate because it lives in the airframe, not the software. And the airframe is the part you cannot retrofit. Underneath the hardware sits a doctrine the Flinch keeps obscuring. The unit of effectiveness is the system, not the platform. No capability operates alone, and judging one as if it did is the most common error in the whole debate. Consider the recurring claim that the A-10 is obsolete. The claim really means the A-10 cannot survive in contested airspace against modern air defenses, which is true, and irrelevant, because no close support aircraft survives that environment naked. The A-10 is a layer. It protects the ground. It needs its own layers. Combat air patrol to own the sky above it, defense suppression to clear the missiles in its path, to do the one thing it does better than anything else: loiter low and slow over troops in contact and deliver fire with a gun and a human eye. Danger close for an hour. Strip away the supporting package and blaming the airplane for dying is the same error as sending an infantryman in without cover and concluding infantry are obsolete. The protector needs protecting. That is not a flaw. That is how combined arms has always worked. The honest design conclusion follows directly, and it runs against the universal platform religion. Do not build a Swiss Army knife that is mediocre at everything because it carries every compromise. Build single-purpose tools, each supreme at its one job, and invest the genius in making them cooperate. Each specialist uncompromised, the system covering the seams that would doom any one of them alone. That yields a force excellent at every task simultaneously, because each task is handled by the tool built for it, with the architecture providing the resilience. The multi-role bet trades per-mission excellence for fleet-wide simplicity and the flexibility of the individual unit. Sometimes that trade is right, but it is a trade. And the country made it wholesale without admitting it was giving anything up. The same logic governs the newest temptation, the drone. Unmanned systems are a magnificent addition to the kit. Mass, reach, risk tolerance, the restoration of the depth that was lost. But going full drone would be merely the next monoculture, the next single-axis bet awaiting its counter. And all unmanned force depends on the electromagnetic link, and the pure fight is above all an electronic warfare fight. Win the spectrum, jam, spoof, sever the link, and a fully unmanned force can be switched off. It also removes the human judgment that the genuinely novel moment demands, the judgment that kept fighting when the script failed. The resilient answer is the team. Human judgment, link independent and accountable, commanding specialized, attritable, unmanned mass. Drones for the mass and the risk, humans for the judgment and the resilience. Neither alone. The lesson is always the same. Do not consolidate the whole force onto one answer, because the counter to that answer takes the whole force down at once. For 3 decades, the Flinch carried no visible penalty, because the wars the country actually fought, in permissive skies against enemies with no real air defenses, did not punish a short-legged, multi-role low-mass force. A bomb truck loitering over an uncontested battlefield is perfectly adequate, and the savings of commonality look like genius. The force was optimized, with some success, for the war it was in. The winds are now shifting back toward peer and near-peer competition, and the Pacific in particular punishes precisely what was traded away. That theater is a tyranny of distance, vast water, few bases, long legs required, and the force was deliberately short-legged for the close-in fight. A pure war is attritional, demanding mass and deep magazines, and the force went exquisite and few, atop an industrial base distilled until it could no longer surge. And a pure contest is a contest of rates. Whoever improves and produces faster wins, and a base of 5 primes with no excess capacity is structurally on the wrong side of a production race against an adversary built to outproduce. Every one of these vulnerabilities was authored at home. in the cuts that traded reach for affordability, in the dinner that traded redundancy for efficiency, and the consolidation that traded the deep bench for the universal compromise. The question then is not really about any single airframe. It is whether the country can rebuild the right force in time, whether reach, mass, depth, and surge capacity can be regenerated before the threat environment finishes turning. That is the genuinely open and genuinely worrying part, because the capabilities the Flinch gave away are the slow ones. Airframes take a decade, industrial base takes longer, and a production race already lost is not won by deciding late to enter it. Everything above is downstream of a larger trade, and it is the part that turns a series of bad procurement choices into a corner the country may not be able to back out of. For roughly 40 years, the American economy reorganized itself around finance and away from making things. Capital, talent, and institutional knowledge migrated from the factory floor to the balance sheet because financialization, buybacks, offshoring, the optimization of money rather than the production of goods, offered higher and faster returns than industrialization. We traded industrial capital for financial capital and called it modernization. The reason this is the worst part, and not merely another line in the ledger, is simple. You cannot surge what you have offshored. The Last Supper distilled the prime contractors to five, but the deeper erosion ran through the entire industrial base beneath them. The sub-tier suppliers, the foundries that pour specialty castings, the single firms that make one obscure, irreplaceable component, the skilled trades, the machine tools, the workforce that simply knows how to build the thing. That substrate was financialized away across the whole economy, not merely the defense sector. So even granting the will and the money to rebuild the deep bench tomorrow, the ground to build it on has been thinning for decades. The war in Ukraine made the consequence brutally plain. The West discovered that its capacity to produce something as basic as an artillery shell had atrophied to a fraction of what a pure attritional war consumes. A financialized economy can produce balance sheets at scale. It cannot quickly produce shells, hulls, or airframes, and the substrate that could takes a generation to regrow, not a budget cycle. The national debt is the constraint that tightens the corner because it removes the fiscal freedom a rebuild would require at the exact moment the rebuild becomes urgent. A nation carrying tens of trillions in debt, with the interest payments alone now among the largest single items in the federal budget, rivaling defense spending itself, has steadily less room for the large, patient, unglamorous investments that surge capacity demands. Foundries, shipyards, redundant lines, and the deep magazines. Debt is financialization written onto the national balance sheet. The future mortgage to fund the present. And when the future arrives needing an industrial mobilization, the credit is already drawn. It is, at the scale of a country, the purest form of one genuinely unforgivable waste. Spending tomorrow's account today and leaving the bill for a moment that turns out to need every dollar of it. And the institution that ought to be the bulwark cannot account for itself. The Department of Defense, whose annual budget now approaches $900 billion and climbs towards $1 trillion, and whose total assets are reckoned at roughly $4.5 trillion, has never passed a clean financial audit. Since the first attempt in 2018, it has failed every single one. 8 consecutive years, each ending in a disclaimer of opinion. The auditors reporting that they were not given enough information to form a judgment at all. The largest organization on earth, consuming a share of the federal budget surpassed only by Social Security, health care, and the interest on the national debt, cannot demonstrate where the money goes. That failure is the whole argument's nemesis operating at national scale. It is the black box, resources poured in, and no legible chain tracing them to capability rather than to waste. It is concentrated, unaccountable power in its purest fiscal form, an enormous flow of money into something that cannot be audited, which means the country cannot even verify that the vast sums meant to buy back the reach it traded away are buying capability at all, rather than feeding the same waste that hollowed out the rest. You can trade capability for efficiency and at least know what you bought. Here we have traded for neither efficiency nor accountability. We spend enormously and cannot prove it works. Stack the three, and the corner is real. A financialized economy that cannot surge production, a debt load that cannot easily fund the reindustrialization, a defense budget so large and so unaccountable that the spending cannot be confirmed to buy capability. Each wall makes the others worse. We cannot industrialize quickly because the substrate was sold. We cannot easily afford to because the fiscal room was spent. And we cannot even tell whether the money we do spend is working because the books will not close. That is not three problems. That is one trap with three walls. And the procurement flinch, the airframes, and the consolidation sits inside it as a symptom of a deeper trade. The whole economy choosing finance over industry, the present over the future, and the black box over the audit. And the flinch is not confined to the past tense. It is happening now, in its most convincing disguise. The nation is investing enormously, but into building data centers, financial operations, and computing infrastructure. The highest return and most abstract activities available, the very direction the deeper trade is always run. This looks like building the future, and in the permissive information age fight, it is a real edge, but it is investment in the multiplier, not the mass. Computation makes a weapon more precise. It does not forge the weapon. An algorithm optimizes the logistics of a magazine. It does not fill the magazine. A protracted war is lost when the base runs dry. The foundries, the hulls, the shells per month, and no amount of multiplier rescues a base at zero because a precise empty magazine is still empty. You cannot multiply nothing. So the country pours its capital and its best talent into the things that feel most like progress and do least for the fight that is actually coming, while the unglamorous physical substrate that wins a long war, low return, slow, capital heavy, and exactly what a financialized economy is built to avoid, stays as thin as before. It's not a failure to invest. It is investing hard with conviction in the wrong dimension. The flinch wearing the costume of the future. None of this is yet terminal, and honesty requires saying so. The United States still borrows in its own reserve currency, which buys more room than the raw debt figure suggests. The reshoring push and the renewed attention to industrial policy are at least admissions that financialization overshot. And an unauditable Pentagon is not the same as a looted one. Much of the untracked $4 trillion is unaccounted for rather than stolen. A scandal of legibility more than of theft, with a clean audit deadline now legislated for 2028. But not yet terminal is thin comfort when the winds are turning, because every wall of the corner takes years to lower. And the one resource the trap consumes fastest is the one that never comes back: time. The deepest obstacle to arresting any of this is not structural, it is perceptual. Too much of the public believes that the country is stronger than it honestly is. And that belief is the saddest part of the whole account, because it is the one failure mode that disables its own cure. Every other problem named here is correctable in principle because you can act on a weakness you can see. Hubris is the weakness that prevents seeing the weakness. A nation convinced it is already strong will not do the hard, slow, unglamorous work of becoming strong because it believes the work is done. The belief in the strength is precisely the thing that guarantees the strength is never built. The mechanism is the same multiplier and mass confusion now operating on public opinion. The metrics that feel like dominance, the largest economy, the most expensive military, the lead in computing, the reserve currency, the brand of being the superpower, are the multiplier metrics, its visual scoreboard. What stays invisible is the base, the shell production rate, the shipyard count, the surge capacity, books that will not close. Nobody puts the foundry count on the evening news, so the public reads the flattering scoreboard and concludes strength, never seeing the thin and eroding mass beneath it, mistaking the multiplier for the foundation, exactly as the policy did. It is not stupidity. It is reading the only number anyone holds up, and that number happens to be the one orthogonal to what wins a long war. Hubris of this kind is the universal final stage symptom of empires near their crest. Rome believed in Rome long after the legions thinned and the frontiers were manned by the peoples who would eventually sack it. Britain believed in the Royal Navy and the empire on which the sun never set right up to the wars that revealed it overextended and broke. The pattern is brutally consistent. The belief in the strength outlives the reach, and the gap between belief and reality is the exact window in which the catastrophe arrives, because a nation certain it is fine does not brace, it doesn't rebuild, and it does not take the threat seriously until the threat arrives and proves the belief false in the worst possible way. Hubris is the anesthetic that lets the wound run deep before anyone feels it. It is why the awakening, when it comes, tends to require a shock violent enough to shatter the belief, a Pearl Harbor, so to speak, rather than the foresight that would have been cheaper, earlier, and far less bloody. And the present age has added a cruel new turn to this old story. This is the first era in which weakness is trivial to identify and to broadcast, and yet the diagnosis lands less, not more, with each passing day. The same medium that lets the warning be published instantly to millions also floods the channel until no signal can be weighted against the noise, discredits the very genre of warning, so that an honest, verified alarm wears the same costume as the 10,000 false and monetized ones and is dismissed on the costume before the content is even read. Sorts any structural critique into a political tribe, so that a nonpartisan truth is waved off by whichever side it inconveniences and rewards the comfortable dismissal with a single frictionless click. Because waving off the messenger preserves the flattering self-image at no cost. The reach went up and the landing went down, and the two are causally linked. The abundance that enables the broadcast is the abundance that guarantees it is not heard. Older empires often fell partly blind, the diagnosis itself the bottlenecked. This one risks falling with its eyes wide open. A perfect, free, verified description of exactly how it's happening, scrolling past, dismissed on every screen. Honesty requires the counterweight here too. It is not the whole public, and the belief is not uniform. There is a real and growing strain of public anxiety running the opposite direction, overstating the decline as surely as others overstate the strength. Nor is confidence itself the enemy. Morale is a genuine ingredient of resilience, and a population that believes in nothing does not mobilize either. The enemy is unearned confidence, belief decoupled from the honest audit of the base, and the channel is degraded, not dead. Serious signal does occasionally break through and move policy, as the recent belated industrial corrections show. The cure is therefore not despair which disables the correction just as thoroughly from the other side. The cure is earned confidence, the kind that comes from having actually rebuilt the perimeter, rather than from the comfortable conviction that it never came down. A thesis about national decline owes a sober word about the gravest stake, offered as a calculated risk rather than a prophecy. The most dangerous moment in a contest between great powers is not the period of one side's dominance, it is the transition. The crossing when a declining power and a rising one pass each other, because that is when the incentives turn perverse. The declining power confronts a use it or lose it logic. Its relative advantage is at its peak now and shrinking every year. So the ruinous argument to act before the window closes grows stronger each time. Stronger with time. The rising power has its own impatience. The crossing is the danger zone, and it is the dynamic that strategists who study power transitions and the catastrophe of 1914 lose sleep over. The nuclear age sharpens this to a knife edge. A state that believes it faces existential defeat, the end of a regime, the dismemberment of the country, the extinction of the thing itself, has, by the cold arithmetic of deterrence, the least left to lose from escalation, which is precisely the condition under which the unthinkable becomes thinkable. The entire architecture of deterrence assumes a rational actor with something to preserve. A power facing its own end may no longer be that actor. And yet the strongest form of the fear that the collapse of a nuclear empire means mushroom clouds, regardless of the side, is falsified by the single most important case available. The Soviet Union, an entire nuclear-armed empire, collapsed, fully, regime and all, in 1991 with thousands of warheads on hair trigger, and not one cloud appeared. Decline, even total collapse, has happened once in the nuclear age without nuclear war. That fact has to be honored because it's the largest test we have ever run. But it has to be read correctly. And read correctly, it is less reassuring than it first appears, because 1991 was the easiest possible version of the experiment. The Soviet collapse fell into a uniquely permissive world, unipolar and stable, with a single triumphant but not threatening hegemon willing to fund off-ramps and help secure the warheads, no opportunistic rival exploiting the weakness by force, and a regime that found an exit it could survive. It was a soft collapse into a soft environment, and that's why the clouds stayed in their silos. The variable was never decline as such. It was whether the dying power was left a path that preserved the thing its key holders cared about without escalation. Today's environment is harder on every axis that mattered then. The world is multipolar rather than unipolar, and multipolar systems are historically the most unstable kind. More dyads, more miscalculation, more ignition points. 1914 was multipolar, and the Cold War's grim stability was bipolar. Multiple active conflicts run at once, raising the risk that crises in separate theaters link and cascade, with far less slack in the system to absorb a shock. And the off-ramp culture itself has eroded. Treaties lapsed, channels degraded. The norm of leaving a rival a survivable exit weakened, which is the most worrying erosion of all. Because leaving an exit is the exact variable that kept 1991 cold. The soft landing was run on easy mode, and easy mode is gone. The calibrated conclusion, then, is neither doom nor comfort. The mushroom cloud is not a property of decline. It is a property of decline with no exit the key holders can survive. A managed internal soft collapse does not summon it. A cornered, invaded, regime-ending one might. The risk is real, and in this tenser and more combustible age, meaningfully elevated. And it is still not deterministic, which is the opposite of a counsel of despair. If the trigger is a cornered power with no survivable path, then the entire task of statecraft is to ensure no nuclear power's decline is ever structured as an existential humiliation with no way down. The outcome is not fixed by the descent. It is shaped decisively by the choices made during it, by whether the declining side is cornered or left a door. That door is the difference between a transition survived and a fire that consumes everyone who lit it. Now, a thesis owes its strongest opponent a fair hearing, so here's a case against this one, stated without flinching of its own. The drawdowns were not gratuitous. The Soviet Union collapsed. A defense establishment sized for that confrontation could not and should not have been preserved whole on a peacetime budget. The A-12 was a genuinely failing program, not a healthy capability murdered by an ideologue. Some consolidation was inevitable and had begun before the famous dinner, which means the Last Supper's causal weight can be overstated. The multi-role platform has real virtues the specialist lacks: a single logistics chain, one training pipeline, the ability of one airframe to retask in flight from escort to strike as the situation changes. Virtues of force that cannot afford a dozen specialized fleets may rightly prize, and the establishment may be relearning the lesson even now. The renewed emphasis on range in next-generation designs and the move toward collaborative unmanned aircraft that restore mass and specialization in cooperation suggests the pendulum is swinging back before the bill fully arrives. All this is true, and none of it overturns the spine. The pattern is assembled, fairly, from the cases where reach was the one thing cut and the cheaper compromise was the thing kept. And the pattern is real even if it is not a law. The honest form of this claim is therefore not a prophecy but a warning. This is the risk we are undercorrecting for, and the cost of being wrong about it is asymmetric. If the flinch is overblown, we have spent on redundancy we did not strictly need. If it is right, and we didn't move enough in time, we meet a peer fight with a short-legged, thin magazine, single-source forced optimized for a war that ended. These are not symmetric risks, and a prudent country hedges against the worst one. Now, if the diagnosis is right, it carries a prescription the country has been refusing for a quarter of a century. A depleted power cannot afford adventurism and must stop. For roughly 25 years, the United States has kept up a near continuous expeditionary war footing, and every dollar, every shell, every airframe hour, and every year of strategic attention spent on a war of choice was spent on the multiplier side of the ledger, consuming the already drained base without rebuilding an ounce of it. Worse than neutral, those wars were fought in permissive skies against enemies with no real defenses, which is precisely how the force got optimized for the permissive fight and away from the pure one. The adventurism did not merely waste the resource, it wasted it building the wrong muscle. This is imperial overstretch in its textbook form. Strategic commitments outrunning the economic base that funds them. The classic accelerant of great power decline, and it is overstretched from both ends at once. The base shrinking under the deeper flinch, while the commitments did not. The founders understood the corrective instinct. Washington warned against permanent alliances. John Quincy Adams said America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. This was never isolationism. This was husbanding. Keep your strength for your actual interests rather than bleeding it out on others' quarrels. The interventionist habit is the historical aberration. Skepticism of it is the original American posture, and the logic only tightens as the base thins. The weaker you have allowed yourself to become, the more ruthless you must be about where you spend, because you no longer have the surplus that once made folly survivable. The honest qualification matters because the opposite error is also real. Restraint is not retreat. and a too sharp withdrawal has its own failure mode. Forward presence and incredible alliances carry genuine deterrent value, and a power that abandons every commitment can embolden a rival and makes the Great War more likely, not less, the lesson that runs the other way from the 1930s. The discipline, then, is not to disengage from the world, but to draw the hardest possible line between wars of necessity, those that defend the actual base and a credible perimeter, and wars of choice, the search for monsters abroad, and to stop fighting the second kind entirely. That distinction is the whole of the discipline. What replaces adventurism is not a wall against the world. It is a wall around the things that must not be lost. The posture this points towards is the oldest sound one. Armed, solvent, and manifestly capable, trading freely and keeping normal relations with all, including rivals, entangled with none, and deterring not by expeditionary bleeding, but by a strength so evidently intact that no one cares to test it. Commerce with everyone, entanglement with no one, the perimeter inviolate. The doors stay open for trade and diplomacy. The wall goes around the vital core, the industrial base, the borders, the magazines, the capacity to defend, the things whose loss is irreversible. This is the stronger option, not the weaker one. And the reason is the difference between latent and expended power. A capability held in reserve deters more reliably than a capability spent, because deterrence rests on what an adversary believes you could do, and nothing erodes that belief faster than watching 20 years of expeditionary war fail to subdue a poor country. Adventurism advertises the limits of power. Preserved capability conceals them, and the concealment is the deterrent. The capable, armed trading republic that keeps its perimeter and its powder dry frightens a rival more than the overstretched one, perpetually demonstrating how little its enormous spending actually buys. And here the argument has a witness who cannot be dismissed on standing. In his farewell address in 1961, Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, the man who ran the largest military operation in history, the least pacifist source imaginable, warned the nation against the very machine this essay has been tracing, a standing arms industry joined to a permanent military establishment was, he said, new in the American experience, and against it he urged a guard. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. For the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. He was not repudiating defense. He was naming from the inside the concentrated and unaccountable power that an unchecked permanent war economy would breed, and insisting that only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry could keep security and liberty prospering together. The address is more prescient still, because in the same breath Eisenhower named the other half of this. Balance, he said, also involves the element of time. The government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering, for our own ease and convenience, the precious resources of tomorrow. For we cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. Democracy must survive for the generations to come, he warned, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. In one farewell, the warrior president diagnosed the complex and the mortgaged future both. The deeper Flinch and the perimeter, named together, by the one man whose standing made him impossible to wave off. The country nodded and did the opposite for 60 years. This essay is, in a sense, the account of what that cost, and his farewell is its truest epigraph. It's an alert and knowledgeable citizenry, husbanding its strength, keeping its perimeter, refusing to mortgage tomorrow so that security and liberty prosper together. Now, return to the reflex. Faced with a costly capability and a cheaper substitute, the institution reaches for the substitute and calls the reach a luxury, and does it again and again with the F-14 and the A-12 and the deep industrial base and the specialist bench, each time selling the trade as efficiently and each time discovering a decade on that efficiency had a hidden price tag the original ledger never showed. This whole thread's not incompetence and it's not malice, not malice. It's a standing preference for the affordable near-term answer over the expensive durable one. A preference that looks like prudence in the quarter it is made, and like a wound in the decade it matures. The capability was almost never the problem. The reach worked, the bench worked, the redundancy worked. What failed repeatedly was the will to keep them. To pay for the full-on version when a cheaper compromise was on the table and no enemy was at the gate. That is the lesson, and it is older than any airframe. A capability is not a possession. It is a commitment. And the moment you trade it for efficiency, you've started the clock on needing it back. The bill always comes. The only variable is whether the threat environment sends it before you have had the time to rebuild. We keep betting it won't. The wind's suggesting the wager's getting worse. Don't flinch from the reach. It's the slowest thing to rebuild and the first thing the next war will ask for.